The story of Peggy O'Neill is a sad one. It was also one that took some time to piece together. It wasn't that her time in Hollywood was chaotic or a complete mystery. No, it was because of her name. The name Peggy O'Neill was being used by at least 2 other hopeful starlets in Hollywood, as well as a woman with a successful dancing troupe, a Broadway actress, and, believe it or not, a hockey player. Later on in this show, I will speak about one of the other Peggys in particular, whose life was getting confused with our Peggy, whose tragic end brought about this story.
What happened? You get brushed off?
No, I'm a farmer, and she just doesn't like farmers.
Did you hear that? Well, tell them about us. You know, the first time I bumped into Peggy, she hated farmers. She despised farmers. She couldn't even stand the sight of me. Isn't that right? Well, then I went to work. You have to plan these things like a battle. Remember what happened? She'll never forget it. What a campaign. Deep down, I knew she was crazy about me, right?
No.
You see, the problem was to make her realize it. After that, she was docile as a lamb. She never gives me an argument about anything.
You never give me a chance to talk.
A woman like...
The story of Peggy O'Neill has come to you by chance. What I mean is that while visiting Calvary Cemetery to visit Mabel Normand and pay my respects to her days before the anniversary of her death, a lovely man who worked at the cemetery had helped me find an urn to place flowers in. He began to tell me more about the people who were also interred in the mausoleum. I knew about most of them, but then he told me about this actress who died by her own hands on the bottom floor. He showed me the crypt of Barbara O'Neill, who I'd never heard of. My director looked at me and said, "Hold on, you're already working on research for the next show." But he could see already the look on my face that the wheels had already begun to turn on researching this young woman, and there would be no chance of stopping me, so here we are. Well, enough of me talking about how I came across Peggy O'Neill. And instead, let me tell you what I was able to learn about this red-headed beauty. Peggy O'Neill was born Barbara Jean O'Neill on April 8, 1924, in San Francisco, to a Mr. and Mrs. Alfred W. O'Neill. In San Francisco, she attended Our Lady of Victory Elementary School, then graduated from St. Rose High School in 1940. She then planned on starting her postgraduate courses at Bates Private School, then possibly moving on to Stanford the following year. In an article from the Santa Cruz Evening News, her reasoning for wanting to go to Stanford was simply because it had a good football team. After school, her dream was to become a newspaper woman and get married when she was about 23 or 24. Barbara was a beautiful girl with red hair, which she hated, brown eyes, and freckles across her nose and cheeks. Barbara never had any ambitions on becoming an actress or moving to Hollywood. She had thought about a career on what was then considered the legitimate stage and had taken lessons along that line in the past. Her future would undoubtedly change in September of 1941. When her mother and aunt entered her in the first annual Redhead Review of Santa Cruz Beauty Contest. She and 82 other contestants paraded in front of the judges in their bathing suits. Barbara would receive the surprise of her life when she was named the most beautiful redhead in California. Her prize was a trip to Hollywood. She would end up taking that trip the following month. She was to visit MGM, Republic Studios, Columbia, and National Broadcasting Studios in Hollywood. From October of 1941 through the month of May of 1943, nothing would be published on Barbara. Then, on June 1st, 1943, the San Francisco Examiner wrote, "Her name is Peggy O'Neill. She is 19, red-haired, and pretty as they come. Peggy is the Hollywood's newest Cinderella. She came to Hollywood from San Francisco in search of a movie job. Fortified with experience on radio and in community theaters, she was called on by agent Leon Lance, who took her to see Charles R. Rogers, veteran producer. I'm not sure why Barbara changed her name. There was a well-known actress at the time named Barbara O'Neill, so possibly it could have been that reason. The majority of information in this item I was able to verify is true, except for Peggy having experience on radio. I would find a radio ad for July 7th at 9:30 stating that Erskine Johnson will present Peggy O'Neill as his star of tomorrow on Hollywood Spotlight. I want to believe that he was talking about our Peggy, but I'm not able to verify that as a fact. I did learn, however, that Mr. Charles Rogers was credited with discovering the likes of Ginger Rogers and Deanna Durbin. In an item from the Daily News in August of 1943 entitled, "Asked for a Receipt, Got Film Contract," Peggy herself swears that she never dreamed of being an actress, and when she walked into the office of agent Leon Lance, the only thought she had in mind was to deliver a bundle of scripts on her arm.
What?
All she wanted was a receipt, and she got a movie contract. This 7-year contract would start her at $100 a week and would advance to $1,500 under terms of the pact. In the July 1943 edition of the American Cinematographer, Charles R. Rogers pens his own recollection of meeting Peggy for the first time. The other day, a very pretty 19-year-old girl named Peggy O'Neill was brought into my office by her agent, Leon Lance. She was looking for a screen career. Peggy explained she had no experience in film and had never been in front of the motion picture camera, so consequently had no screen test to show me. We chatted for a few minutes about her background and education, and a few of her appearances on the stage of the San Francisco Community Playhouse. She then read some lines from a script, and I immediately signed her to a long-term contract. He would continue to speak of his plans for Peggy, in particular a story he was holding on to for a long while. In the case of Peggy O'Neill, I had a story called Peggy O'Neill, filed away for several years, waiting until the right redhead Irish type of girl came along to fit the title role. The moment Peggy walked into my office, I knew she was the girl I had been looking for. Why bother to wait for a screen test, which I knew would be good? Perhaps by waiting, she might be signed by someone else. Beautiful of face and figure, 5 feet 5 inches tall, gorgeous brown eyes, and a head of red hair such is rarely seen, an engaging smile, excellent breeding and education, graceful in motion, pleasing in speech. That is Peggy. In July, Mr. Rogers also wanted Peggy to star in the movie version of a popular radio show, One Man's Family, for United Artists. When I went through Peggy's credits, this title did not appear. I'm not quite sure it was ever made. There was mention of One Man's Family still being produced as late as May of 1946, then it disappeared. It did, however, become a TV series in 1949, so maybe it was felt that it would do better on the small screen as opposed to the big screen. Charles Rogers would purchase an original story by Irving Phillips and Edward Verdier entitled Song of the Open Road, in which Mr. Rogers planned to star his new discovery in, surrounded by tunes and technicolor. The expectation and hope is that audiences will come out singing, "That's Peggy O'Neill." The theme of the story is that of college youth in wartime, harvesting crops, entertaining servicemen with song and dances, headquartering in American youth hostels. Such items in the newspaper would state that Song of the Open Road would star Peggy O'Neill. Then, as months went on, more names began to trump Peggy's in relation to Song of the Open Road. Sammy Kaye and his orchestra were signed on, then Bonita Granville as one of the female leads. We would then read that Edgar Bergen and his pal Charlie McCarthy would also be joining the cast. But in November of 1943, we would learn that a 14-year-old singer who was under contract with MGM would be joining the film. MGM had not been able to find a picture for the girl, but now she would be co-starring with Bergen and McCarthy. The little singer, who would be making her movie debut in Song of the Open Road, was Jane Powell. Peggy would be playing the role of Peggy in the film, which would be released in 1944.
If you eat so much, you'll get to be a very pudgy little girl.
I should worry. I'm not interested in men, thank heaven. It must be a terrible handicap.
Only if they're not interested in you.
Now don't you pay any attention to her. It's just tall talk. She's really crazy about me, and I don't care how fat she gets.
Of course not. He needs somebody big enough to protect him.
Over the next months, Peggy would be mentioned in a few Hollywood nightlife sightings. She was seen at the Biltmore Bowl with David Selznick's young player, Eric Sinclair, and then at the Beverly Tropics with Harold Ramin. Referred to as the slim, lovely, Tahitian-haired youngster in The Press Democrat, was seen at a club clowning around with Frankie Hares and Pat Harrington, and proved to have a promising singing voice. In a November 18th item, mentioned red-haired Peggy O'Neill had taken part in a USO tour of Kiss and Tell. In December, the Hollywood Citizen would speak of Peggy about being in Hollywood and seeing Hollywood transition into Santa Claus Lane for the Christmas season. I've spent all but 1 year of my life in San Francisco and always thought it was a wonderful city, but I have never seen anything so thrilling as Santa Claus Lane with its 2 lines of giant smiling Santas. I not only was lucky in getting a start in pictures, but I am lucky to be living in a city such as this, where business leaders refuse to permit the ruthlessness of enemy nations to make them forget the spirit of Christmas. In January of 1944, there was another mention of Peggy taking part in the USO show Kiss and Tell, as well as touring Army camps and hospitals. In April, the Hollywood Victory Committee, along with 19 actors and actresses, which included Peggy, visited 52 Army and Navy hospitals to entertain disabled servicemen. Other entertainers included Eddie Cantor, Brian Donlevy, Lloyd Nolan, Gloria Stewart, Lynn Barry, and several others. In the same month, pictures of Peggy would be used in ads for Westmore Makeup, who did the makeup for Song of the Open Road, as well as clothing advertisements featuring the young actresses from the film. Song of the Open Road would be released in theaters in June, and reviews would begin to make their way into the papers. Jane Powell was the obvious breakout star, and not much would be mentioned about her co-stars. For Peggy, the Los Angeles Evening Citizen would mention her name as part of the good supporting cast. In the Los Angeles Times, the reviewer said, Bonita Granville is the starriest of the group of young people, while Jackie Moran, Peggy O'Neill, and Bill Christie are okay. Nothing would come of the film Peggy O'Neill. Whether Song of the Open Road took the other movie's place, I don't know. Maybe that's why Peggy's character was named Peggy. In July, Peggy would be mentioned as part of another film. The Los Angeles Times would write, Glamour is heralded for the new Sonia Henning film, It's a Pleasure, at International, because producer David Lewis has engaged 6 handsome showgirls, Alma Carroll, Ruth Filoni, Mickey Malloy, and Dorothy Coster, who were in The Belle of the Yukon, and Georgia Lang and Peggy O'Neill to adorn the film. Filming would begin in August.
Applying for the job, I hope.
He ought to know some Malloy.
No kidding.
kidding? He's never made a pass at you. No, honest, Lonnie. Come on, Chris, get into your costume. She doesn't know what a pass is. She thinks it's a free ticket to a show.
I was unable to find out anything about her personal life. At some point, probably during the filming of Song of the Open Road, Peggy met the screenplay writer of the film, Albert Mannheimer, and the two began dating. The only other personal information I was able to find out about was her residence, which was an apartment on Rossmore Avenue. It was reported in one paper that she lived alone on Rossmore Avenue, while others said that she lived with her mother. The night of April 12, 1945, Peggy was supposed to have a date with her boyfriend Albert, but she was late. Newspapers would have the same story about what occurred that night, but with some extra tidbits not mentioned in others. Some reported Peggy showed up late to Albert's apartment in Beverly Hills for their date, and they had an argument. The argument ends with Albert leaving to attend the theater alone, and Peggy remaining in his apartment. Other newspapers reported that Peggy did arrive late to Albert's apartment, but not alone. Peggy arrived in a car with an actor named Eric Hall. Mr. Hall said that he had tried to explain why she was late, or possibly why he was with her, but Albert drove off to attend the theater performance. The newspapers, though, were all in agreement as to what happened next. Albert arrived back at his apartment a little after midnight. When he entered, he found the table set for dinner, with some reports saying that a steak dinner was prepared. He went into his bedroom to find Peggy lying on the bed, dead, with an empty glass in her hand. Again, other reports have her lying on the living room floor. Wherever she was found dead from an overdose of sleeping tablets. Fort Worth Star-Telegram would have Mr. Mannheimer telling police, "I thought it would all blow over." In the same report, her agent Vic Orsady said that she was due to sign a major studio contract the next week. He stated to the press she had everything to live for, and it was true. She was 21, beautiful, had a promising career, and friends would also add an engagement that would soon be announced by Peggy and Albert. How bad was that quarrel of theirs? What could have been so bad that would leave her to feel that death would be the only solution to her problems? Peggy would be interred in the main mausoleum at Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles under her real name, Barbara J. O'Neill. A life ended way too soon. Now, some of you who know a little about Peggy may be saying, well, I read her being in some other movies besides the two mentioned here, and that she eloped in January of 1945 with a soldier. Well, I read these as well from various sites. It's true, Peggy O'Neill was in other movies and eloped with a soldier, but it's the wrong Peggy O'Neill. Like I had told you at the beginning of the show, there were a few Peggy O'Neills in the newspapers, some in the same town and state as our Peggy. There was a Peggy O'Neill in San Francisco who had a dancing troupe. There was a brunette Peggy O'Neill who was a model from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then there was a blonde stock player under contract with MGM named Peggy O'Neill, who was about the same age as our Peggy, and she was the one that often gets confused with our Peggy. The blonde-haired Peggy was the daughter of Lambert O'Neill, who was a manager at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. It was here that blonde Peggy worked as a junior hostess for the Officers Club at the Beverly Wilshire. Here is where she would work with Pat Parrish, who was the other girl who too joined Peggy in eloping with servicemen in Las Vegas. Both girls were said to have met these men at the Officers Club where they worked. There is even a photo of both ladies proving that it was indeed the blonde Peggy. I had already been scratching my head trying to figure this out, knowing that red-headed Peggy was in a relationship with Mr. Mannheimer. How was it that she eloped with some random serviceman? Now, as for the other film titles Peggy was said to be in, well, they were most probably the credits for the blonde Peggy O'Neill. One title was called All-American Co-Ed from 1941. This was made about 2 months after redheaded Peggy won the beauty contest. I sat and watched the film on YouTube, and the role of the grape queen that was supposed to be Peggy is obviously the blonde Peggy. As for the others, newspapers reporting her death mentioned that she was only in 2 films. The 1945 Penthouse Rhythm has Peggy as a party guest. She was probably alive when this film was being made, but as for her being in it, I personally don't think it is. The same could be said for the film You Came Along, where she is listed as a model. I've seen photos of blonde Peggy in publicity photos as a model, so again, I think this is probably this Peggy and not our redhead. The last title, The Hoodlum Saint, has her listed as Cigarette Girl. The movie came out a year after our Peggy died, and it is an MGM film. The blonde Peggy had a contract at MGM, making me believe that this is indeed the blonde Peggy. So, there you have it. I'm glad I did research on Peggy, because now I can give you the real information about her that is hopefully free of blonde Peggy's life. Our lovely redhead deserves to have her own story told, as do all of the personalities that I bring you. I will end this show with the lyrics of a popular Irish song, Peggy O'Neill. If her eyes are blue as skies, that's Peggy O'Neill. If she smiles all the while, that's Peggy O'Neill. If she walks like a sly little rogue, if she talks with a cute little brogue, sweet personality, full of rascality, that's Peggy O'Neill.